tell you a little bit about my experiences, a personal experience of Dan O'Connell and how we got to know each other. Dan showed up after he had been with the California Association of Family Farmers. He had been working with the Riverlands Trust, Sequoia Riverlands, and I don't know if you realize all the work that they've done. If you've been out to the Oak Preserve in Visalia, and they have been instrumental in preserving many beautiful areas. And that has been the thing that we've been wanting to preserve. Beautiful areas that are under threat, along rivers, along areas that are sensitive, and he's been involved in that. But Dan saw another need. You know, we do want to have national forests and national parks. We've been in them, they're gorgeous. I'm glad that all the people did what they did to set them aside. But there really hasn't been a national, I guess I would call it a drive, it hasn't even been a subject of how can we preserve farmland, and not only farmland, but preserve a way of farming, and that way of farming that preserves the land that we do keep. And that is what Dan saw, and he was the first to go and ask the question, what are the farms that are in danger? Where are the farms that are being farmed correctly? How can we preserve them? What can we do to stop the leapfrogging of development and so on? And so Dan landed at Sweet Home Ranch, and I knew right away farmers who were about ready to lose their farms due to developmental pressure. And even in my area, just a half a mile from my house, there are developments of 100 to 120 homes going in on prime farmland. And they call them after what they took out. For example, vineyard estates, or, you know, I mean, it's just, that's the practice as it goes. So here's Dan, and he said, look, we want to stop this development, and we have some mitigation funds, and we'd like to buy the developmental, the rights, and make this farmland forever. And could you give me the names of some farms that are in trouble, and that we can help them, and we can put a stop to this? And so that's how I got to know Dan. And then beyond that, he began to work in larger circles. For example, American Farmland Trust. And he moved from the Riverlands Trust to American Farmland Trust. We were very excited about that move because we knew that Dan would get into that group and stop it from sliding toward the corporate ideal. But it's going to take more than one person to move that large group, which has in many ways sold out. And so the American Farmland Trust, it's not very trustworthy anymore. And as a result, he's no longer with the group just because of his passion, because of his stand. And now he's doing other things, and here tonight you'll hear about all of the work that he's done, not just to preserve the farmland, that's a big one, but also the way of farming that preserves the land into perpetuity. And so it's been an incredible adventure to be with Dan O'Connell and to follow his passion and to be a part of that and to watch him work. And because of him, Sweet Home Ranch and the ranches around me are in something that we call farmland forever. They can never be anything but farms, and they will remain small farms. So it's kind of exciting, and it's because of Dan O'Connell that this move has started.
Well, Dan was born in Los Angeles and born and raised there, and went to high school at Woodbridge High School in Irvine. He's a classmate of Donna's. Dan was a star football player. Donna was a cheerleader. But those things didn't work the way those things often work until much later in life, of course. 1991, Dan started at UC San Diego, where he got a BA degree in history, specializing in the Americas, and particularly Latin America. And through those years, between that and the start of his graduate studies, well, I think this probably extends beyond this period, but Dan's religious journey has been really interesting, and I'm not going to say much about that, except that I found some really deep connections here when I talked to Dan about this, because there are a lot of similarities between his journey and mine. Dan is currently Quaker, but he grew up Roman Catholic, and he now considers himself Quaker, Roman Catholic, Buddhist, and Anabaptist. And that also has a lot of resonance with me. So, in 1996 to 1998, Dan served with Peace Corps in Namibia, in post-apartheid Namibia. Namibia is on the west, it's a desert country on the west coast of Africa. I think I have that right, I was going to look that up, but I think that's right. When he came back in year 2000, he began his graduate studies at UC Davis, where he holds a Master of Science in International Agricultural Development. 6 years later, he went to Cornell to do his doctoral work, and we heard from his dissertation professor, one of his dissertation committee last week. He finished his dissertation in 2011, and the dissertation is entitled In the Struggle, and then it has a subtitle, but In the Struggle, of course, is the name that we've given to this series. So, you know, we've come to really love Dan and Donna, and then we find out all the things that he's done, like academically, and Paul talked about other things besides academics. But here tonight we're going to hear some of the fruits of his academic work. Dan, we're so pleased to have you here, and we're pleased to have you for this whole series.
What an honor it is for me to be here with you. It's funny hearing the story of how I was released from AFT and how Paul counseled me on that. They kept warning me to not talk about poverty, and I thought, you know, I'm going to be incredibly off message if I am in the San Joaquin Valley talking about saving farmland and not talking about its connections to poverty. But the irony of this is that I always knew, and I had, with Janaki, began to speak out on the issue of an upcoming settlement with the Westlands Water District. And I also knew that my dissertation was there waiting to come out. And so being released there has freed me in a lot of ways, freed me to do work that's maybe even more aligned with my calling. And so sometimes life segues here and there. And the dissertation, which we're going to go over, is an extraordinary story. It's as extraordinary as the geography that we all live in. And I'll say to you, because we live here, that we take it for granted of this place and how special it is and what histories have played out here. I always knew that it wasn't enough to get the story credentialed by academic institutions, and in fact I have known the limitations of what that special kind of knowledge has done. Of course, I value and honor it, and I bring forward with this presentation, we in this series will hear from some of the scholars that were in those earlier battles. 3 of them are gone now: Paul Taylor, Ernesto Galarza, and Walter Goldschmidt. And I'm going to talk about each of them to a degree today, because very soon we're going to have Don Villarejo, Dean McCannell, and Isao Fujimoto, all emeritus scholars in their own rights, coming to us in October. After that, it's not enough then. Where are we and where we're going? We know now that demographically this place is changing, and it's changing to a degree because of the demands of agriculture. Once the Bracero program ended, there was an encouragement of Latinos to seek residence here, Mexican origin Latinos. And that future, I don't represent it, and many of the people in this room don't represent it, though we have deep affinity and we are likely close allies with the movements that are going to be coming. I will say, though, that Sarah Ramirez and Janaki Jagannath are absolutely the future of what's coming here, and I can't speak highly enough of how much faith I have in the work that they're going to do, and they're going to actually culminate this story that I'm going to tell you today, because I see such dramatic changes happening. It's the stories that I'm going to tell you were extraordinarily controversial, and in fact, in the 30s, people were killed for labor organizing here. After that, many people lost their jobs, which is another fine little point there that I always knew was coming. if I started speaking out against the Westlands or speaking for the poor, you always expect that. In the doing of it, and it'll be one of the lessons here, is to maintain your center in the midst of that political pushback that you're going to receive. So, if it wasn't enough to have the story credentialed academically, though I realized the importance that scientific validity has for our society, that special kind of knowledge, and I knew that I wanted this stamped with the highest credentialing, which is an Ivy League school, and from two of the most famous land-grant universities in the United States, Cornell and Davis, before I came, and I knew I would live here. The universities are a little too antiseptic for me, and the beauty of African community, of farm worker community, of small farm communities is a spirit that I love. So the first thing I did, having a dissertation in pocket and working as the Farmland Conservation Director at Sequoia Riverlands Trust, was I was working with Scott Spear. He had been a farmer in his own right, 40 years, almonds and grapes down in Tulare County. But I went to his father-in-law, Ray Malikian, who farmed and actually had advocated against the implementation of reclamation law, which we'll get to in a minute, but unknowingly so, I would say. He was a World War II fighter pilot, a greatest generation, very, very, very respected here in the Valley. I gave it to him at 96, and he was still smart as anything. He read it. When he got back to me, I was holding my breath a little bit because he was bigger than the 160-acre limit. He said to me, "Dan, every farmer should read this." Since then, I've had people such as Don Friesen, somebody with the dignity of Don, read it and encourage this conversation. I've had somebody like Tom Willey read it and put butterflies in there, which is an honor, and I told Tom, please don't take those out because I'll value them forever. This is a story about democracy and agrarian democracy and farmers, and a few missed opportunities, but we'll come back around to them. Tonight I'm going to, and I did also want to thank Mark Alvis, who's putting this together, who wanted to make this a film right off the bat, and it is very cinematographic, the story in so many ways, but he and many others, upon reading this, have taken it upon themselves, and we as a human community carry our knowledge not necessarily in statistics, those are very effective to instrumentally control the world. Our best way of sharing our knowledge is through story, and Mark is an expert at that with filmmaking, and I just wanted to say how much I thank him for participating in this. I'm going to go over 3 parts to lay out the introduction of this for you. The California Institute for Rural Studies has this on their website, a link under their events for this speaker series, and my dissertation and a few other academic articles are at the bottom of that. Also, just get in touch with me and I'll share this. You can have the dissertation. The dissertation is purposely written, half of it in the first person narrative voice of the scholars themselves, to talk about the political pressure that they had when they were asking the question of what is the effects of consolidated landowning and monopolistic control of an economy on rural community. They asked that scientifically and went through methodologies to prove it. And Goldschmidt's hypothesis and McCannell's retest of proving it establishes this hypothesis, which we'll go into. But I always knew that I wanted this to be accessible to people, and that regular folks have read it and gone through it. Sometimes I say skip the first 3 chapters since they're kind of methods and theory. But it is, and I'll read from you in their voice some of these scholars, Paul Taylor, Goldschmidt, Galarza tonight. So the first section here, I'm going to go over context and background. I'm going to kind of probably look over at what pictures are up there. Doesn't Paul's art completely represent the ideal? The second part, I'm going to talk to you about Walter Goldschmidt, the Central Valley Project, and the Arvind Dainuba study, which Trudy has already talk to you quite a bit about it. And she is probably the greatest flag bearer of this, and she'll be speaking here also, mostly focused on Paul Taylor, who she was the last research assistant to Paul Taylor at the end of his life. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about Ernesto Galarza. And I'm just going to warn you that Galarza's voice is different than Taylor. I even pondered even bringing him out because he's so ferocious. Paul Taylor was a Marine lieutenant who fought at Belleau Wood. He was tough as nails, but he was a very subdued guy. He was a Midwesterner. Galarza was Mexican-American, Chicano. He was working in the field at 8 years old. He did every job under the universe, and his voice is more strident, and I think it expresses the frustrations of many of our young people today that experience poverty and racism. So I wanted to go over some terms that would be very important for you to reference, and raise your hand and interrupt me if you need me to explain some of them, because this story is very understandable to me, but I've read it so many times I just can go over it. The 160-acre limit, a bit of a euphemism for a number of things. Sometimes I'll call it also the Arvind-Danuba study, but it references Jeffersonian democracy and the philosophy of Jefferson as he's starting the country, a revolutionary philosophy. And it's expressed in two different laws. The Homestead Act of 1862. This is why the Midwest was all 160-acre parcels. And the theory is a simple one. And it's one, the question I often pose when I'm talking about my dissertation is this question, is what economic policies and programs, perhaps what economic system, is most conducive to a democracy? Seems like a very simple, straightforward question. What economic policies will ensure that we have a democracy, and which don't? And the answer that comes back through Goldschmidt, McCannell, through Jefferson philosophically is an equitable one. One with the middle class. One where people are vested in the land and each other. We're still needing to learn this lesson to a great extent now, but this story, because of these scholars are positioned as objective people doing research for the US government or for the University of California for public institutions, and then having the government itself censor their information, shows you the influence of money on politics and on democratic processes, and that's why it's such an important story for us to get out from behind, to tell the backstory. And you'll hear it very soon from Esau, Don, and Dean in the first person, and it's dramatic. I'm going to take some of the people before this. So the Homestead Act, the Midwest was all small farmers. This is why Kansas had the Grange and was very populist in character, and why Wisconsin and Minnesota and many of these places had those populist movements at the turn of the century, because there was a more equitable economic system and they were fighting and defending each other. They had rural opera and they participated in rural life together as well. Their small towns probably felt like Reedley, right? The Arvind-Danuba study is the research that was going, reclamation law, under the 160-acre limit. So in 1862, you have the Homestead Act. In 1902, Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, says we're going to bring water to the arid West. If you bring water to an arid region, you raise the speculative value of that property automatically the next day, because you can go from dryland wheat to almonds, or houses, if you will. So Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive, when Republicans were progressive, did not want to encourage speculation or benefit the already wealthy. He wanted to ensure a law that would ensure democracy. So his law, and the law that was the law of the land that was never implemented here, stipulated simply, if you receive federal water under the Central Valley Project or any other dam in the western United States that the Bureau of Reclamation builds, you have to live on the land that receives the water, no absentee owners, and you have to own 160 acres or less. And if you own more land than 160 acres and you willingly sign the contract with the government, after 10 years, you have to sell all the land that you have at pre-water prices. The law was designed to implement a land reform. Which we actually instituted in Japan and many other countries around the same time period because of the feudalistic nature of what created fascism. So, to prevent feudalistic orientated government, you want a broad-based ownership, community ownership of the economy, if you will. And so Theodore Roosevelt in the Reclamation Law was specifically set up to redistribute property in a very mild way to ensure democracy. And we'll see what happens when that was attempted. So the Arvind-Danuba study is the study that's going to ask the question whether that law should be put into effect. And you know Arvind-Danuba, Arvind's current county. Braceros program started in 1942 because if there's two great subsidies, there's a number of great subsidies. The land grant itself is subsidizing through its research, the farmers and the scaled industry, but the two big subsidies that the government gives to large, already industrial scale landowners is labor and water. And they come both at the same time about World War II. All of our boys fighting overseas, the government brings in labor from Mexico, called the Braceros program. It's tens of thousands during the war. It becomes hundreds of thousands when the law, Public Law 78, is passed in 1951. Hundreds of thousands after our soldiers have come home, the law is re-upped and continued for another 10 to 15 years. An extraordinary subsidy and something that subsidized, that diminished the labor. You can go to the next one. I call this the garden. The San Joaquin Valley is the garden, right? It was Serengeti scale wilderness with grizzly and Lake Tulare with how many animals, you know, the snow geese and the winter waterfowl, 100 million, 60 to 100 million blotting out the sun, tule elk everywhere, probably a lot of mosquitoes. I don't want to romanticize it too much. And good next one. And there was three valleys there, Sacramento, the San Joaquin, and Tulare. The lake was in the southern part. The garden redesigned, I didn't know what to call this. And I did want to say it's extraordinary what we've done. We've created another garden. And we have to acknowledge how science, that rational, instrumental science has worked so well here. The externalities of cost, they want to control something, so they need to control it. So we need to import water if you don't have it. You want a stable system to be able to do this. So everything in this map here is in green is irrigated farmland. The dark green is prime farmland, and the cities are right on top of the prime farmland. So a number of people in the room are trying to save the farmland from sprawl. I'd say everything, much of the land here in light green is going to be in solar in the future. There's just not enough water, and the droughts and the climate change. But we'll see how that plays out. So the Mexican land grants are an important facet to this. Just before 1848, there was a lot of land grants that were given in the 2 or 3 years before California became part of the United States. So I don't know how prescient some people were, but they got a lot of land just before the turnover, and those were, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, those were valued. So Tejon Ranch is one of them here, is a Spanish land grant, for instance. Orange County had a big Spanish land grant. And so already land holdings were consolidated and large right from the get-go. Small farmers were facing headwinds from the beginning. So The Octopus and Blood Money, two early novels from both talk about the Muscle Slough tragedy that happened in 1880. The first book here is in 1882, and the next one, the more famous one by Frank Norris, is 1901, in the middle of the Progressive era, and they hit right at the perfect time when the muckraker journalists were going after the robber barons. Perhaps it was because of the Great Depression, perhaps because of the Dust Bowl, and the Okies and Arkies coming out here. 1939 is a heck of a year for the beginning of this critique of scaled agriculture, of industrial scale agriculture, and it represents itself in two books. First is Carrie McWilliams, factories in the field. When Olson became governor, he became, I think, the Secretary of Natural Resources or something, and caused headaches for a lot of people, and then went on to be editor of The Nation. And John Steinbeck goes without saying of how well he himself is a storyteller of this tragedy. Dorothea Lange, isn't she in the mix there? Maybe you go to the next one too. So, the migrant mother, the photograph, and leafing through Lange's photos can cause me to weep. I mean, just sheer beauty of them, the pathos and the beauty and empathy that generates in me for people, for humanity. And Paul Taylor, in his writings, and how dignified he was about this also. So I'm going to start off now by reading a quote to you from Paul Taylor. He's discussing reclamation. If we were discussing the water situation, reclamation, I would read to you right now of what Theodore Roosevelt said in 1911 before the Commonwealth Club. He warned the, quote, very wealthy men he was addressing of the, quote, ruin they would bring upon themselves if they pursued on exactly the course they were pursuing today. The land monopolists have controlled the enforcement of reclamation law and torn the law to ribbons. What bothers them is that controls over speculation and monopoly still are the law. They haven't been able to wipe them off the statute books yet. So they know they are in an uncertain, perhaps even precarious position, violating the law. They know it, but they keep the knowledge from spreading widely to the public. I've exposed this in writing. The law journals are filled with my articles on it. The Bay Guardian prints it, 30,000 circulation, an underground sheet, they call it. I fill the congressional hearings year after year with my testimony exposing and documenting what they are doing, but nothing happened. What I say is buried in print. That is my frustration. The law goes unenforced. It's hard to make the average person understand what the issue has to do with him or her. It's so fundamental to a society in which he or she lives, yet it's hard to tell a Californian who runs California and what giant land holdings have to do with it. As a Californian walks down the street and breathes fresh air when it's fresh, the question doesn't occur to him or her. He or she takes it all for granted without examining it. They don't understand the power structure that's been built up, nor upon which it rests. You can go. So, Paul Taylor was the craftsman behind the Arvin Dainuba study. He recommended that that Mendota or Firebaugh should be compared with Dainuba. But Goldschmidt and others at the Bureau of Ag Economics who conducted the study thought that the differences would be so extreme they would be unbelievable. So they chose Arvin because comparing Mendota at that time to Dainuba would be it would be too grotesque, I guess. So I had returned from Namibia, post-apartheid country. I was very happy to go there to deal with some of the dirt that my country had done during the apartheid era and do my little part. And I came back, wanting to go back to Africa, missing it. And so you need a graduate degree if you're going to be a program manager. I went to Davis, and a professor said to me, he was a returned Peace Corps volunteer, well, Dan, why don't you study in California? It's like Peace Corps with resources, and you can work in a farm worker community. And I did an ethnography for 2 years looking at social segregation and how it worked by interviewing whites on where they chose to bring their kids and looking at the discourse of their decisions. Racism is in our culture, right? It's not embodied necessarily one person. At the end of those 2 years, I met Isao Fujimoto, and that same professor handed me As You Sow. And the thing you realize about As You Sow, because Dinuba was way better than Arvin, period. And it was proven so. And so what comes to you is the backstory that Goldschmidt was supposed to do a second study, and the government censored and suppressed the first one and disallowed the second one. So censor the Arvin Dinuba study and suppress and not allow the second one. Trudy?
I think you might want to connect, if I connected the comparison of the towns with the farm size surrounding them, that's just, it just slipped your mind.
Thank you. So the reason that there's a difference between Dinuba and Mendota, or Dinuba and Arvin, was that Dinuba was surrounded by small farms. So it gets to test that a case study is what was the research design that was set up, very simple one. So how many churches did the comparison have? Dinuba had way more churches. How many civic groups? How much retail economy circulated? Money is the blood of an economy, right? You want it circulating in your town. If you have one big owner, the money flying out of the town, and the landowner likely lives in LA or San Francisco and doesn't care about the civic life of your town. Arvin was unincorporated, Dinuba was incorporated, on and on and on. It was double the retail economy in Dinuba than in Arvin in this test case. So in both civic and economic life, Dinuba was a better community. The catch is there's problems with the case study. There could be other reasons Arvin is better, or Dinuba is better and Arvin is worse in this case. So to take it up is, the second part was a 25-city study that was going to do regression statistical analysis, testing the same categories and criteria and see, and that was never allowed at that time. What is the next picture? I think it's of Goldschmidt. This is Walter Goldschmidt. There's so many pictures of him, and I chose one when he was older, when I knew him. He was almost cherubic, but when he was young, he was something. This is Walter Goldschmidt testifying before Congress. I should say that we were never satisfied with the idea of making a comparison of two towns only, and we had from the outset planned a second phase of the study, but we were prevented from doing this. The story of why we were prevented is perhaps more revealing of the problems derived from large-scale operations than would have been the results of such an endeavor, and I must therefore review these events briefly. I was ordered by the bureau chief in Washington not to undertake the second phase of the study. He did so in response to a buildup of pressure from politically powerful circles. I am not indulging in these reminiscences merely to explain why the second phase was eliminated from our research, but rather to suggest that there are interests in this country, or that they were at the time, which did not want the evidence of the effect of corporate farming brought forward. They wanted to suppress the study, to defame it, to discredit it. It seems clear that efforts to suppress, discredit, and answer the study were inspired and fostered by those who did not want this data known. I believe that similar efforts will be made in respect to any endeavor to replicate the study in California or elsewhere. It is for this reason that it is of the greatest importance not only that the study be updated, expanded, and brought to bear on areas such as your own state of Wisconsin, talking to the senator, and elsewhere in the farming heartland, but that it be done with the sponsorship and support vital to the Committee of the United States Senate. Now, let's play this out. The cooperative extension system, you heard Scott talk about the land-grant cooperative extension. Cooperative extension starts in 1914. Well, they need a partner organization. Do you know that the Grange was already active through the valley? But the cooperative extension system wanted to partner with agribusiness. And therefore, the Farm Bureau was housed at UC Berkeley for 20 to 30 years. The Grange sued the university because of this subsidy, right? So you have a purposeful efforts to scale and subsidies that are happening. Yeah, go on to the next. So the picture on the right is Kern County And McWilliams and others talked about it just represents so well the comparison between the small town community and the larger scale community, which is largely unpeopled, right? When you head west, there's almost no people on the land anymore. So it's not only functions, and it's a lot of monocropping. So why let academics tell us this? Why not have Wendell Berry? In rural communities dominated by very large farms, the settlement and housing patterns reflect the increased transient nature of the labor force. The symbol of the large corporate farm becomes the trailer house. Community institutions suffer from lack of leadership and from lack of a sense of commitment on the part of the labor force to long-run community welfare. Those institutions that survive take on a dependent character reflecting the paternalistic role of the dominant firms. Income levels may stabilize, but at the expense of a decline in local capacity for risk-taking, decision-making, and investment of family labor in farms and local businesses. In The Unsettling of America, 1977, which this quote is from, he also says, "The standard of the exploiter is efficiency. The standard of the nurturer is care. The exploiter's goal is money, profit. The nurturer's goal is health. The land's health, his own, his family's, his communities, his country's." And I know many of the farmers in here know of Wendell Berry personally. You can go on. So George Ballas, National Land for People, I have to mention. So there was a lawsuit brought in Ivanhoe in 1958 to implement the federal law. Paul Taylor's law review article from Yale was cited in a 9-0 Supreme Court decision saying you need to implement the law. The law was still not implemented. The law was never implemented, right? Only one farm ever was sued and had to comply, and even the settlement was a travesty. Elfie sues the federal government again with some farmers that are alive today. I still meet them, some in Stanislaus, some down here that were with him, and he was going to implement the law. And again, he wins the case. The irony being that the large agribusinesses, which usually hate environmental impact reports, say that you need to do an environmental impact report to forestall the implementation of the law until the Democratic senators are no longer Lafayette from the Midwest fighting for democracy. It's Cranston here who's just not interested. The country is tired from its social justice efforts, perhaps in the 60s and 70s. Reagan is elected in 1980. By 1982, the law is overturned. Regrettably, Paul Taylor lived long enough to see that law overturned that he fought so stridently to implement. It's a loss of extraordinary proportions. But Elfie, who many of you know, who is probably even more known for his photography during the UFW organizing, was a character and passed away a few years ago. But he tried to bring this law into fruition, to bring land to small farmers and to rebuild the economic base of our rural economy. So, city of Fresno, look at the year, 1936. It's the middle of the Depression. Would you believe it? Go to this street corner right now and it looks worse than the Depression, right?
Do you know what street corner that is in?
I think it's Van Ness and Fresno, I think. I'm going to end with Paul Taylor as we look at this picture, which all the farmers, all the movie houses downtown, all the farmers came in on the weekends. It was a fun time. That town, people were walking around and dressed nice. Here's Paul Taylor, the Midwesterner, coming out to talk about what he witnessed when he got out here. California agriculture is not American agriculture at all in the northern or Midwestern sense. It is plantation agriculture, more in the southern than the northern tradition. It is a totally different situation from the Midwest, and it is a shock for a Midwesterner to learn from it. I've been up against it studying it and trying to change it all of my life through my agriculture, labor, and water studies. This has meant exploring land and water monopolies and the power structure of California. California agriculture is based upon the monopolization of the large Spanish land grants, not on the homestead land pattern from the Midwest. One way or another, these lands were all gobbled up by a few owners in the first quarter of the 19th century, in the third quarter of the 19th century. First, they grabbed most of the land. Then, when they knew the water would come, they grabbed up the rest of the land, every acre of it, and they hadn't grabbed already. Speculation on a gigantic scale. Since then, they've been working to pump the money out of the treasury to pay the costs of bringing the public's water to the private land, and so reap the harvest that they've been after for 100 years. This is the corporate takeover of land and water resources. Now, they're working to permanently rivet their power over land and water. A heavy price is paid both within the academic world and outside, because instead of emphasizing foresight to avoid problems, we wait until the problems hit us in the face and then try to figure out what to do. I don't know whether we'll ever make it, or whether they are going to rivet us on the monopoly of land perpetuated with the monopoly of water. It is going to be very bad if that program does go clear through to the end. Goldschmidt's study is called As You Sow. It's a biblical forewarning. So you will reap. If you don't do this, you're going to reap the consequences. And with Taylor saying that very bad program, that is our reality today. As You Sow was written in the 1940s, talking about what is potentially the good society that can come, or the problems that we are living with now. It was foretold. The last thing I'll say about that is how we need to take back the narrative, and we do it through knowing a history. When I drive down the freeway and I see Congress-created drought, really? Really, because you want to squeeze a little bit more because the salmon might get up to the dam? It is the upending of the real narrative that the Congress created, turned this place into the garden revisited or redesigned. And all of that water that's going to the west side of the valley or to Kern County is water that is not theirs, it's ours, and they broke the law to take it. I didn't finish by telling you that, you know, the 1958 Supreme Court decision that said they should implement the law. Notice that in 1959 the State Water Project comes in. The State Water Project had no acreage limitation or residency requirement. So they were, in every sense of the word, the system was gamed from the beginning. And now I'm going to shift in the last part of the presentation, and I'm basically going to read you from Galarza on the other piece of this puzzle that Taylor was on top of the whole time. He was studying Mexican labor way before it was a topic anyone looked at, and then he looked at water at the end of his life. So Ernesto Galarza is tough. He's a fighter, huh? And he comes out here, he somehow was a farm worker at 8, but he went to Occidental College where he got his BA, he went to Stanford, and then he went on to Columbia. When he graduated with a PhD from Columbia, he arrives in the San Joaquin Valley in 1949 and goes after DiGregorio Farms at Arvin, right? In 1949, leading a strike right from the get-go, and begins leading strikes. Here is 2 quotes from Ernesto Galarza, and then maybe we'll open this up a little bit for a few questions. But I always find it hard to synopsize Galarza. I also just admire, being Irish, I admire very tough people. We had been at it. We had been in it, the Union, out here since '46. The big strike was Di Gregorio, which started in October 47, I was wrong. And the efforts to organize continued to the end of 1959. During those 13 or 14 years, to make a long story short, those 10 years, 50 to 60, were years in which there was no hope that we could organize farm workers. All we could do was to build our own knowledge of the Bracero system and keep hitting at it until we could reach a stage where public opinion was so convinced that the arguments of the growers was a fraud. And when that climate had been created, we could then move into lobbying stage in Washington and gain enough support from friends of the union and those who were seeking the truth. And that only then we could hope to repeal the Braceros Law. We did it in '63, but our union was out of business in 1960. We had to disband because we were not, from the point of view of labor leadership in the United States, an orthodox union. We were constantly stepping on the toes of growers and banks and others who had their own understanding with certain other portions of the labor movement. So we were a threat to the way in which power was put together in this state. I never made any bones about it. I always said to our members and whoever would listen to me that our union, if it lasted 30 years, would change the power structure of California. I just love the guts of somebody going for Augusto, huh? That was our goal. And this was by no means a part of the philosophy of organized labor in California. So we lost ground until 1960, and then we were faced with this dilemma. The State Federation of Labor had long cut off any financial support. I think at top of our record, the State Federation of Labor was giving us $2,500 a year. We started out with 4 organizers in California. We each had areas of the state, and by 1955, we were down to 1, and that was myself. Now, obviously, with 1 organizer servicing 17 locals from Mexicali to the Oregon border, that's no labor movement. So, part of the answer was that the growers just wore us out. I was hospitalized for 3 months in 1959. I couldn't move, just fatigue. The other reason was that by 1960, the leadership of the labor movement had made up its mind that we weren't a good bet, and that the word got out that we were inefficient. Here we'd been in the fields 15 years and had no contracts. We hadn't reduced any grower to terms. What kind of nonsense is this? All during those 10 years, I doubt that we were getting more than $300 or $400 a month from organized labor. But even so, we had been proved to be incompetent. And by 1959, the suggestion came down from Walter Reuther to us that the best thing to do was to turn in our charter. And I told Walter to go to hell. My advice to our president was, give the charter back to me, and he can do what he wants with it, but we're not going to be ordered by anyone. So by 1959, we were in the worst possible shape. No money, no organizers, no support, and all these suggestions coming to us to get lost quick. So from September of 59 to May of 60, the liquidation went fast. Now, Galarza might have been the most effective scholar of all, though some of them are playing such a long game, and you have to think of them as working collectively together. And we have to continue to actually, a truth doesn't die until the last person stops knowing it and fighting for it. So their effort isn't gone. But Galarza fought to undermine the braceros, who were used as strike breakers all through the western United States. Notice the dates. 63, the Braceros program. 64, it's dismantled. His union was completely dissolved by 1960. But he kept fighting, and he published his Merchants of Labor, a book that dismantled the justifications of the Braceros program, Public Law 78. And Braceros ends in 63, 64. When does the UFW start winning contracts? The next year, right? So Galarza knew exactly what needed to be done. He wrote books and multiple different kinds of texts for different audiences, and his tactics met a strategy that played in for the public benefit over the long haul. And he was tough enough to push it through almost by himself. I'm going to end with Galarza being asked by the Chicano Studies Department, or Chicano students, in the 1970s at UC Berkeley. How fun. I reacted with intense interest to a remark that was made this morning that one of the difficulties of the Mexican American community is that it has not pinpointed the enemy. I ought to tell you that some 15 or 20 years ago, more than that perhaps, I asked myself that very question. I had been working and living with farm laborers in the state and had moved with them up and down the state for many years, coming at last to the conclusion that one of our difficulties was that we had not defined the target. Who was the enemy? So I spent some 10 years of my life in an experiment. What happens to a Mexican American community and those who presume to lead it when they do pinpoint the enemy? And we did. We helped to organize some 20 locals of farm workers in the state, from Yuba City to the Mexican border, and it was our continuous effort not only to organize the farm workers, but to try to help them to understand where the enemy was. I think we succeeded. In fact, the best evidence that we did succeed was that we were so thoroughly destroyed. In some 10 years of what I call dynamic research, and by this I mean in areas of social experience where information is awfully hard to get at because it's very closely guarded, the only way to get it is to go out and not ask for the information, but to challenge those who are keeping it themselves. In California, it became obvious to me that the way to get at the understanding of why farm labor was so exploited and lived so miserably in 100 hamlets in the state, the way to do that was to engage the enemy. So we organized with the purpose of taking down a peg or two the power of the Associated Farmers of California, of the banks and insurance companies who have very high investments in agriculture, and of institutions that carry a role in the background as investors and as manipulators of wealth. Step by step, in a series of strikes, we challenged that power. We named institutions, we named persons, we named places. Through the years, the picture unfolded, but to the degree that we did define the opposition grew in strength and determination to destroy the Union, and it did destroy the Union. I want to warn every Mexican American, and you could just think American, perhaps, who thinks himself a leader, before he puts together an organization of any kind that is going after specific targets of power, I want to warn him he's asking for some pretty rough treatment. One of the things that we found out, for instance, was that the agencies of government, they are not Mexican American agencies. They're not inventions of the Mexican peasant to come to this country. They aren't inventions of the Mexican peasant to come to this country. The agencies of state and federal power were conniving, collaborating, and conspiring with the economic power structure to destroy the Union, and they did. Now, the story of how that destruction was accomplished is a very important story. I've written a couple of chapters on it, and I commend it to you with no sense of immodesty, because it only describes a specific instance in the destruction of a growing community among the farm workers in this country, but it describes how that destruction was accomplished. I think that any challenge to the power of this democratic United States is going to, as of now, run into the same kind of difficulties. I'm going to end with 2 slides and then and not be as pessimistic as a Chicano in the 1970s or as a Midwestern scholar in the 1950s. Next one. So there was less, I think, you need to theorize when you at a research university, the work that you watched. Through these stories, I learned how they were effective. This is what I learned from the 6 scholars. Practice supersedes theory. I often will tell an undergraduate, especially if you're going into the social sciences, do not go right into grad school. Go out into the real world. Pay your rent. You won't be able to develop theory if you don't know the reality of it. And I will tell you the best people who theorize work, Eddie Valero, who started Young Men's Initiative in Cutler Rossi, was the smartest scholar I've ever known at Cornell. Grew up here, Sarah is brilliant. Middle class white people struggle with theory because they barely know that there's racism, right? Hybridize roles and shifts positions as necessary, and for sure do not hunker down in a university far away from the context of the problem. Engage problems directly over extended periods of time, and this suits my Quaker nature as well. If it has to be, it has to be generational work, and that's what we see in this story, with scholars picking up, as Trudy says, the baton, the flag. Hold, carry, and share truth. And in fact, truth is so connected to my idea of God, it's almost the same word. And there's also probably an equal sign to love there, right? What else is there? I do work in the prisons. Sometimes I can feel anxiety come up or scare, worry. And I know I've drifted away from God then, because if you're walking in line with the truth, there's no fear, right? So it's always time to pause and to address why you're afraid. There should be no fear. Expect political reaction, obviously. If there's pressure indicates relevance. So if you're not feeling something, you're not doing relevant work. And then why are you doing it? Persevere through adversities. Leverage legal precedent and public process. Paul Taylor fought to implement a law. Galarza fought to get rid of a law. Design research to interrogate social problems. Produce texts for varied constituencies. Enable social movements. So I'll end with this. And it's wonderful to know that there's, I love coming to the First Mennonite Church. I love coming to the Reedley Peace Center. I'm also a member of the Visalia Friends meeting. Christians who don't kill people are my favorite Christians. So down in Visalia, they have a project where they've now accepted use. Bill and Beth Lovett have donated 22 acres to the Friends meeting. Friends usually don't do well with owning property or managing it. But we manage that difficult process as we do communal decision making, where everyone is empowered to stop the process. We accepted it, we're all bearing responsibilities, and we share it now with the Wachumna, native Yokud tribe, who had already come to Bill and Beth and said this was a spiritual gathering place, and we want to do ceremony here. In the back of the property, there's a sweat lodge, and they gather there times. And there's Miztec, Oaxacan farm workers who also share the property and way outdo us in their community garden. So two indigenous peoples, one with a farming heritage and the other that were hunter-gatherers, share it with the Quakers and the Unitarians and other faith communities and other people. I know that small farmers are under extraordinary pressure, not only because of the drought, because of the increases in labor. I was for increasing labor and for overtime pay, but it's going to hurt some of my favorite people. The irony, that the large-scale people already are putting almonds in because you don't need people to harvest an almond, but you do for a peach. And a lot of the labor is, or a lot of the land is continuing to consolidate here. I have hope that we can work with these indigenous peoples, not only here, but globally. I lived in Africa, where they didn't own the land. And the native peoples here, they never conceptualized owning land like we did and do. What is the hybridized system? What does it look like? I don't think we know it yet. And if we don't get a way of caring for ourselves and each other and the earth, that I think indigenous peoples know much better than us, if we can't learn and share capacities, we're in for a tough time, especially now that there's global ecological and economic crises marching upon us. But we're a social animal, we're a social being, people. We are going to do beautiful things in this effort. And I will say, globally it's tough to say what's coming, but I will say that in the San Joaquin Valley, things are getting better. Because of that encouragement, once Braceros ended of residency and for whatever other reason, I work with Latino community. I work with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability and the Community Water Center, all groups that John Aki works with. Isabel and Irma Arroyo at El Quinto Sol. They are wonderfully beautiful, vibrant, tough. This story that started maybe with a few white men and then came into a few Latino men and a Japanese American man will be finalized with I think a lot of Latinas and other folks leading the charge, and we should help them, and we need to humbly do so as well. They are leaders that are younger than us. So either in our small spheres with the farms that we have and how to envision sharing those and bringing them together in community, how perhaps Mennonites and Quakers can work together to develop ideas of, Mennonites are much better farmers than Quakers, I'm sure, and they sing a lot better too. And share that with indigenous peoples, that hybridity, and the wonderfulness of being together to problem solve is a great hope. So I'll end with, things are going to get better, not worse, but we're going to face strains still. But the San Joaquin Valley could be the largest Swiss valley ever known. We haven't ruined it yet, right? And I think we will succeed, but it's going to be a decade or two more work. Thank you. I don't know if we went over or what.
Yeah, if you're interested in asking a question, we invite you to step forward, please, so we can get the question into the video and on the radio. And if you wouldn't mind speaking directly into the microphone, and if you're comfortable, please give us your name.
Yeah, Dan, I wanted to thank you again for helping our farm to become a farmland forever. One of the things that's happened is that, we're getting older. I can't farm forever. But by putting that land, and I hope more farms are thinking of this, and I know that you helped dedicate another large farm out along the Kings River going into this. One of the things that I've noticed is that our farm is no longer very attractive to the major speculators, because they can't look to the future to turn it into some kind of subdivision or something else. And so on my horizon, I believe we'll end up with neighbors. And what's happened around us is speculators have purchased much of the land, and there are no people. There are no pickups going past with people that I've ever gotten to know their name. Even waving at them hasn't really slowed them down. So I think, Dan, first thing I want to say is thank you, and I want to share in your optimism. On my horizon, I am seeing an actual person, a neighbor, who has children, and I can see that, and that came as a result of stopping the speculative positioning that has been happening. I'm wondering, I do see a tremendous amount of consolidation of land around me. And do you think that there are going to be more farms that are going to become interested? Will there be funds to be able to buy that? And where will those funds come from, the mitigation money, to buy the speculation values, the developmental values? Where is that money going to come from? The rail, the high-speed rail, or that takes over land? Where do you see the purchasing power coming from to buy these developmental rights from farms?
So the first answer isn't, it actually goes to something I forgot to mention at the end. It's from Bart McAllister, who came out with the American Friends Service Committee. Olga McAllister is 97 in the rest home in Visalia today. He helped start self-help enterprises, SciCon, Audubon, like that. Bart McAllister would say, if If money is your only problem, you don't have any problems. And so it's my operating premise for community development, because so often money is the first barrier. If even a few people decide to do something, you can make it happen. But and we really do have to set our minds on a vision and drive the vision forward, even if it's just a very few of us. Maybe even make it a spiritual thing. You know, my favorite quote, and I'm not good at quoting the Bible, is when two of us gather. You know, I'm there. But we don't have to go there, Paul. The state of California is going to help us tremendously. And me and Jonathan are going to go after those dollars. And hey, Swearingen and Rambla just the other day stood on a podium with Jerry Brown, and $70 million of half the cap and trade money is coming to Fresno because the Republicans, Democrats, in this sense, lined up together and advocated. There's a law that says cap and trade is going to put a price on carbon. And it's going to be, at least we'll see if it's implemented. There's some legal things that are going to happen. That's billions of dollars. And 25% of those dollars are obligated to come to environmental justice communities. And we have, because of this history probably, a lot of those communities. The vast majority are in the valley. So, in fact, I foresee an issue where we won't be able to have infrastructures to receive the money very well. I think we have to begin to retool away from just advocacy of what we don't want to build infrastructures of what we do want. So, self-help enterprises that started off with building housing is now providing pipes to bring water to rural communities. Food commons, vertically integrating along the food chain, smart, purchasing land, purchasing businesses. We need more of those social benefit for-profits or non-profits that are looking entrepreneurial, and just sheer for-profits that could use this money and do the right thing, which they exist. And we, as a farming community and as conservationists, need to continue to advocate. The dollars are already going to flow to farms through conservation easements. Having the Farm Bureau advocate for farmland conservation would be a great help. And sometimes because of their constituency, they have a lot of different spokespeople on their boards. Well, let's just shine a light there and say, why are the ag commodity groups and the Farm Bureau not advocating to save farmland? I wonder, is the Farm Bureau of LA County very viable anymore? I don't think so. I want to say thank you. This is, it's the people in this room thinking that there's Tom Willey here and Fred Schmidt, Foxmans and the Crabels. It's as much of an honor for me to be in a room with you all as it is to walk in the footsteps of the scholars that are here and to see the two narratives join in so many ways. So the series is going to progress now. You're going to hear the rough treatment that a few scholars had when they arrived in the University of California and tried to start basically a rural sociology department. The University of California never had a rural sociology department. Right? You get that? It's a land grant. They never wanted to ask the question. Sociology, economists ask, why is an individual poor? Sociologists ask, why is a community or a region poor? The University of California never permitted the question to be asked. That's the power of what happened here. You'll hear from scholars that came from Cornell and tried to start it here, and that's Dean McCannell, Nisa Fujimoto, and I think next week you'll hear from Don Villarreal. Don went to Cesar Chavez and said, you need a research arm. And Cesar said no. And Don went ahead and created it anyway. And he was both the rural sociology department and he was the research arm of the labor movement for years. He was a mentor of Sarah, for instance, a close friend of all of ours. And he'll be here next week. So thank you very much.
Question. Where does and why not has Cesar Chavez entered into this?
So I went through Galarza's papers, and Galarza had a list of all the West Side growers and their acreage and whether they had signed a contract. He was going to go after them, right? And at the least, I didn't look very much at because I think Chavez was just simply organizing a union, and then I think one of the things Cesar wanted to do was create community, looking at cooperative structures beyond unions. But in any case, I don't know. Almost all union people do not like guest worker programs, let's just put it that way. One of the few things I did in the dissertation was Galarza would call Mexican immigrants wetbacks, wearing a labor union hat. And you saw, that conflict between people who are used to break strikes and as scabs and those who are trying to build a labor movement. So certainly not having Braceros was helpful in this sense. I do think that Cesar worked to create cooperatives and housing and move beyond just looking at wages, and it's certainly where we need to be now as well. Thank you.